Well, hello, John.
Hey, Aaron, nice to see you.
You as well.
We missed January, so I've been really looking forward to getting together again. And I'm really excited and been thinking all day about this topic. So I'm really glad to be here.
Me as well. And I'm certainly curious about this topic as well and have been spending a lot of time thinking about it. And I wanted, if you wouldn't mind, to start with a little story.
Yes, sure. Go.
Awesome. Now, for everybody listening in, please note when I said I wanted to start with a story, John didn't roll his eyes like all of you do when I say I want to start with a story. So thank you, John, for inside outside voice. I appreciate that. The story I wanted to tell was about a leader by the name of Darren. And Darren is a leader of an ambulance service and specifically in a clinical department. And as he joined this organization, he was always asking himself, how will I create a culture within the organization, within the clinical department that is high employee engagement? Knowing that often clinical departments have a piece of themselves where they challenge employees, they read charts, they have a medication error, and then there's a path. So there's often this feeling at times that can be punitive. But as Darren had been thinking about how he will lead and the ever-evolving emergency medical services and the care, he began thinking about curiosity. But he added one more piece, and it's the second piece that really caught my attention and has me really thinking. And so Darren's mantra is this, that he wants himself, his leaders in his department, and his department to be curious, but not judgmental. And that second part is what really caught my attention because I think I'm aware of a new diagnosis that I have. I'm a judger.
Mm.
And as he talked about that, it just hit me square in the face of when I'm faced with a challenge, with a situation, do I immediately become the judger? I've got it all figured out. I know what's wrong. I know why they did it. I understand all their motives. Or am I curious? And I think I have a lot of work to do on the curious side. So I'm really hoping to do a bunch of learning today as well, John. So that story got me thinking about this topic, but I was curious. There it is. From your perspective, why is this so important? You've been thinking about this and talking about this for some time now.
Yeah, so it's like Groundhog Day all over again, right? We just keep hitting these same problems within this industry and we're not solving them. So we continue to keep coming back to workforce issues. We keep coming back to funding issues. We keep coming back to issues of getting the attention that we need. And what we're doing today is not working.
Mm.
And so I think that what we have to do if we're going to make progress is begin to cultivate a deeper level of curiosity.
Mm.
And so and I just want to point this out, when you keep banging your head against the wall and something isn't getting solved, there's something that you're missing.
Yeah. John, and I really appreciate that context. I think many of the folks that we're privileged to work with over time have certainly tried many tactics post-COVID or even during COVID to really combat many issues, but the workforce one being the greatest. We've seen sign-on bonuses, we've seen shift differentials, we've seen all of those things, but yet they've not fixed the underlying cause. And what I hear you suggesting is we're not sure what the underlying cause is yet. Have we been curious enough to figure it out? So what is curiosity? I mean, we use this word all the time. Do we know what it means?
Well, often we think about, so we just think about some of the fun stuff that kind of swirls around it, right? Curiosity killed the cat. Mm. And we think of Curious George. the old children's book series where the little monkey ran all around and Curious George got into trouble. And in many ways, curiosity has sort of a childlike and also a negative connotation. But curiosity in what it is simply wanting to know. It's this desire to want to know or learn about something, or perhaps even everything. But it is often, and it has feeling overtones to it. We'll certainly approach it today from an intellectual standpoint, and we'll talk about some very specific aspects of it, but there's a feeling tone to it. When I feel curious about another individual, or I feel curious, let's say I go to a restaurant and I get served an amazing piece of pie that tastes better than any pecan pie that I've ever had before. Notice how the curiosity emerges, and I want to know what's in this pie. What made this stand out? And there is this feeling tone to it. It emerges from inside. So I mean, what I would encourage people, if you want to understand a little bit more about curiosity, is ask yourself, when did I really feel genuinely curious last?
Yeah, and if I could, I'd like to see if you agree, I think there is some critically important byproducts of curiosity when it comes to thinking about our culture and engagement. Okay. So let's imagine you're one of our staff. And there are two kinds of leaders within our organization. One of the leaders regularly comes and talks to you, but you pick up very quickly that they ask you questions only so that they can tell you what they want to tell you. So it'd be like, hey, John, how was your weekend? And I really want John to not talk very much because I want to tell him what my weekend is. And I find out that John is a woodworker and I am as well. So I really don't want to hear about his woodworking skills and talents and projects, because I want to tell them all about mine. So I'm wondering, just pause there, what that feels like with culture engagement. But now let's imagine there's a second one. There's a leader who comes and says, hey, John, how was your weekend? And John talks about this trip that they took and all that flat tire on the car. The person doesn't jump in and tell their own stories. Oh, I've had that happen. Let me tell you what you should do next time. But instead spends 5 minutes just listening to John talk about his weekend. Then maybe discovers something about John, woodworker, and begins to ask questions about his projects. Maybe asks if he could see some, asks if there's something he's working on and some skill and talent he's trying to develop. So my wonderment, as I'm trying not to use the word curiosity, my wonderment, if we remember back for those that have participated in our leadership academies and our discussion about the triune brain, now the limbic system, the emotional part of our brain, things there are sticky. It's where storytelling lives and when influence lives. Which one of those two leaders is going to be more sticky? I mean, think of ourselves. When someone in our life was really curious about us, versus you bump into that person and they simply want to tell you what's going on with them, and you pick up on that really easy. How that feels, how your heart swells. Isn't that a place we'd want to work? Isn't that somebody we'd want to work for?
And I'll even go you one better. So I would hope that my curiosity makes the employee feel better, right? But here's what I want to say to you as a leader. One of the tricks our brains play on us is our brain thinks that it's really going to be, so take the first leader who wants to hurry up so that he or she can deliver the message that they want to deliver. So here's what I want to say to you. As a leader, you are going to have much more fulfillment and satisfaction by being curious rather than being certain, judgmental, and not curious. And all I would say is don't take my word for it, practice it. Notice an exchange where you are simply using the opportunity to deliver information or deliver a message versus an exchange where you genuinely begin to explore the conversation with the idea that you might learn something new or change your mind.
Yeah. And I think the true test with curiosity, this willingness to hear something new or different, is with the people that we like the least.
It's a tough one. That's really tough. And yet you are nailed it, because that's the way to really begin to work with the people. And there always will be people that rub us wrong.
Yep.
They're always going to be. And we're always, as leaders, if we are take leadership seriously as something about influence, and if we're going to influence people, we're going to have to influence the people that we don't like. And that's where we really have to find the curiosity.
Yeah. And I think you've kind of mentioned a few things, but I wanted to ask you very specifically, in this busy time where reimbursement is at all-time lows, where finding and keeping people is a crisis that I don't think our industry has ever seen. And I don't think we've seen even the beginning of the tsunami that's coming our way with recruitment and retention. When communities are asking more, when competition is increasing, consolidation is on the rise, with all of these things challenging our industry, and that's even assuming they can get the supplies and trucks and all of that, why should a leader add this to something that he or she should be working on, should be worried about, should be practicing?
And so I'm going to be really blunt.
Good.
Because every one of these issues is a leadership issue. Every one of these issues is a leadership issue. And we like to blame the economy. We like to blame the pandemic. We like to blame the political bickering. We like to blame the new generation. But these are leadership issues. So here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest that there are some specific things that a leader should get curious about.
Right.
So the first thing I'm going to say get curious about is not your problems. I'm going to say the first thing you as a leader should be curious about, and I hope some people jot these down, but the first thing is be curious about your own experience. The quality and character of your leadership, i.e., your ability to be influential and be successful, is going to be determined by whether or not you're having a good experience. And how do you know that? Are you finding calm? Are you finding satisfaction? Are you finding a sense of growth and development? Or are you feeling frustrated? Does it feel like your plate is chronically full? So the first thing to get really curious about, and we'll talk in a minute about how to operationalize curiosity, but the first thing to get curious about is your experience. The second thing to get curious about is really, where am I going? If I'm leading, whether I'm a supervisor or a CEO or a chief, the question is, where am I taking my people? What am I trying to impact? And get curious about that. And am I clear about that? Because if I'm not clear about that, and you and I find this over and over again, we ask not only leaders, but we ask teams, do you know where you're going? And we often hear a very mealy-mouthed answer. So get curious about your experience, get curious about where you're going. And the third thing is get curious about the people that you're trying to influence.
Right.
If you're trying to influence a boss, get curious about them. If you're trying to influence a board, get curious about them. If you're trying to influence city council, be curious. If you're trying to influence a bunch of 20-year-old EMTs, get curious about them and truly be curious about them. And that leads to the next thing, which is, as you get curious about them, get curious about, how do I influence them? Not why are they knuckleheads or why don't they listen or anything else, but be curious about, how do I influence them? And I have one more. So I've said, be curious about your experience, about where you're going, about the people you're leading, and what it would take to influence them. And the last thing I want to suggest is be really curious about what you as a leader are interested in now, because that's going to be operating in the background. If you're not interested in this, you should know that. If you're not interested in a new generation of people, if you're not interested in making your company the absolute best it can be really curious. And what we find with tired, worn out leaders who are always busy, who don't go skiing, who don't take time out, what we find those leaders is their interest in everything is flat.
Mm.
Notice that?
Mm. And I wanted to really hit of those great points, two of them. And the first was for the leader to be noticing their own experience.
Great.
So I'm going to call it out. Of my generation and of John's generation, working hard and being burnt out, gruff, ornery, cranky SOBs was a badge of honor and often the path to promotion. If you didn't pick up thousands of shifts, if you didn't miss every kind of special occasion with a family of those that you love and lived with, you weren't clearly long for this profession. And many of those individuals, like myself, now are in executive positions in EMS organizations. And I have to tell you, if you read the material about the worker we're after, the 20-something, the job experience is part of their life. They want it to be a positive experience. It's not a means to an end. It isn't you go to work, we call it work for a reason, and you hate it and you're grumpy and you're this and that. The people that we want to have part of our organizations, the 20-somethings, see work as part of their life experience. And if they see you burned out, grumpy, constantly overworked, overburdened, overtired, all of those things, why would they want to come work for you in your organization? They don't have an interest in that at all. So the third, being curious about your people, really again connects back to that first one, which is, do we believe that the people we're leading look like us in the mirror?
Mm.
And that's a real tough one for me. My military background or my Myers and Briggs, preferences tells me that I'm a certain kind of individual that preferences things and enjoys things and doesn't enjoy other things. But that's not the person I'm leading. There's not a whole bunch of me's, thank goodness. You could disagree at any point there, John, but we'll come back to that. But are we trying to lead the person we're looking at? And I want to also acknowledge a leader that, John, you and I get to work with a lot, which is Ben Wasman. Ben often says there's two sides of every story. And I think it's a different way of talking about curiosity. And so he will often talk about how he has almost made some of the biggest mistakes in his career, but thankfully he paused and was curious and learned something new or different, which completely changed the path he was on. Yes, it might have been an employee issue or a complaint or something, but that curiosity to say, yep, no, I heard you. And yep, that sounds pretty tough and pretty difficult. And yeah, I think the consequences are pretty straightforward, but there's another side here. I'm curious what that one will be. What will I learn? What new or different information? How will I not be judgmental until I've gotten that other part of the story? So of those great topics, that first one and that third one catch my attention because it's a lot about the leader. The leader needs to start to be really aware of themselves, and I think really curious about this new generation and not label them. They're not dedicated because they won't pick up every open shift. They're not hardworking because they ask lots of questions of us. They are lazy because they're always using technology. Rather than labeling them, why don't we really figure out what makes them tick and how we take those unique skills and talents and leverage them in our organization? Be really curious rather than judgmental.
And I love that you picked those two out. And I'll just say one other thing is, and I know you agree with me, if you and I had a scholarship fund
Mm.
And we could do a 3 or 4 day retreat for all the people listening to this webinar podcast. What I would want to bring them together in a wonderful, relaxed setting and simply spend time talking to them about their experience.
Mm.
And here's why, is because I think that if we as leaders became more curious about our experience and actually more hungry for a better leadership experience, we'd become better leaders. And I am worried that we're often troubled that great people, great employees don't aspire to climb the leadership ladder. And I think part of the reason they don't is they don't see very many leaders in this industry having a good time and being effective leaders. We see some having a good time at the expense of their people, but we don't often see people who are leading and in having a good experience themselves and deeply caring about their people. So if of all the things we mentioned, the one I would hope people go away from here and look at first is get curious about your own experience.
Yeah.
Because when you dig into that, you're going to begin to want to lean into this role in a healthier, better, more productive way.
And I think I've talked about this on past Leadership Alive, but I've really been noticing many leaders seem to be at a fork in the road. So I've begun to call it my theory of why, right? So the why, that the straight, and then the two forks. And I think what I'm seeing in leaders is they're sitting at this fork in this road that says, I'm burned out. I'm not happy anymore. I'm frustrated. The job isn't fun. The trials and tribulations aren't something I signed up for. This next year or years are going to be much more difficult. But instead of choosing a fork in the road, one is maybe I need to go. Maybe I need to find a different experience. Maybe where I'm at in my career, there's a different opportunity for me. Or I need to start to reimagine my experience. I need to find that joy that I had 30 some years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago. But I think leaders, if you live at this fork in the road, you're destroying your organization. You don't get to live at the fork in the road. Pick one of the paths, not only for yourself, but for all that you work with. Because living here at this fork, we're seeing how it kind of cascades down through the organization.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one of our clients who's at the end of his career and is preparing for retirement. And this is Mark Thompson at Mobile Medical Response in Saginaw, Michigan. Mark came to that organization at a very difficult time when the organization was financially unsustainable. And this is a large organization with about 800 employees and serving 150,000 calls or so a year. But Mark was somebody who found the balance in his work. And not only was he able to turn MMR around, and it's in a better place with a great leadership team that's working toward the future. And it hasn't always been that way. He's had to make some tough decisions. But one of the things I want to say is Mark is at the end of his career with a deep sense of fulfillment and satisfaction and success. And I want to encourage you to get curious about your experience with the aim toward having a better experience. Leadership should not just be about grabbing power and grabbing financial rewards. It should be about really getting to a place where you can look back and say, I've made a difference. And those intrinsic rewards are we kind of call them energy pills. There is what will get you up. That's what's going to give you the energy is to really get serious about having a better experience.
Yeah. And I think we've begun this, but I wanted to ask your opinion about how will leaders begin to operationalize this? So we've talked about some theories and some concepts, but when it comes to the brass tacks, how do I roll up my sleeves and begin to do this? Because as you and I have talked, and as we talk about it in our different academies, there's things about us that may make us less curious, whether it's cognitive biases, whether it's my Myers and Briggs personality preferences. There's many things that make curiosity more difficult than it could be or should be. How will you suggest that we begin to go about making this actually part of our regular practice of leadership?
Well, I'll start by just talking about the neuro psychology part of this for just a second, just because you mentioned it. And that's that in a way, our brain preferences the status quo and preferences certainty. And so it feels there's probably some evolutionary component in which less energy is expended.
Or it's the safest, right?
Yes.
If the path I'm on has kept me alive for pick your number of years, but yet if I take that one, our evolution, the fear in our brain says, don't take that one because I know this one will keep us alive.
Yeah. So here's how you operationalize it. And a way to do this, so I'm going to mention several things, but the first thing I'm going to mention is a little bit odd, and it's called fall in love with a problem or an opportunity.
Mm.
And the next one I'm going to talk about is give up certainty and then step back and find a different perspective. And then a very practical suggestion, which is make a question list. But let's go back to the first one, the fall in love with a problem or a possibility. And I'll talk about one of the most profoundly influential people in the development of EMS, which was Peter Safar. Peter Safar fell in love with the problem, and the problem had a very near and dear root to him. Had a daughter who died of asthma and of respiratory arrest, and nobody could breathe for that kid until they got the right medication on board. And he is really the one who pioneered this idea that without any tools, we could actually begin to breathe for people, which then led to sort of the further development of him and others in CPR. But Peter Safar then got really, really curious, and in falling in love with this problem, got curious about what else we could do. And we know Kevin Hazard's wonderful book that's just come out about Peter Safar's development of Freedom House in Philadelphia, a black advanced life support ambulance service that was one of the first in the nation and really led the way. He and Nancy Caroline really developed this. But at the very core of Safar's work was that he fell in love with the problem. So what does that mean, to fall in love with the problem? It means really slowing down long enough to identify it as a problem and stop seeing it as a barrier, but actually as a doorway to something new. So let's say the problem right now, let's say the problem that and if you start at the top of our list and you say, I'm not enjoying this very much, that's the problem. Or the problem is we keep banging our heads against the wall and don't have enough people. When you fall in love with a problem, you cease to see it as a barrier that should be hid from and feared, and instead a doorway. So that takes us to the second one, which is to really, in order for us to fall in love with a problem, we have to give up the certainty of what we know. We have to enter into a place of unknowing. We have to say, you know what? To be curious here, I have to enter into this space that says, I don't know what that's all about. And that gets us to step back and take a different perspective. The minute we say to ourselves, I probably don't have all the information here. I probably don't have all the understanding I need. I probably don't know what I should know about this. That opens a door. And that leads us to this last one, which I think is as we assume this different point of view, a very practical thing to do is this kind of fake it until you make it
Mm.
is practiced here in the question list. So let's say it's a workforce issue or a funding issue or your own experience issue or anything like that. Just start making a list of questions. What am I asking about this? So for me, I'll just share something with you. And many of you know this because you know that at this stage of my life, what I'm very interested in is the mental fitness of our workforce and of first responders everywhere. And the problem that I fell in love with led to a question. And the question is this: is it possible to be a long-term first responder and have a full, satisfying, and amazing life? And on the surface, of course, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But that brings up the question of why do so many not enjoy it? Why is the trajectory for so many first responders, starting with high joy, leading down to a lot of cynicism and a lot of negativity and a lot of lack of satisfaction? So notice the question list that sort of cascades down from that. So my encouragement is fall in love with this problem, then really give up your certainty, get a new point of view, and start making a very practical question list.
I love that list. And what I hear in that is this need for leaders to do some work. And the part I might suggest really goes underneath all of those items is we do have to do our own work. It might be my preference is this, my experience is this other thing. If I won't do that work first and accept something about myself, I might do superficial responses to those pieces. So I'll use the Myers-Briggs, the MBTI, for a moment. Mine is an ENTJ. And so the T, the thinker, and the J, the structure, are really strong in me. So when I'm faced with something, those are often the two things that come out the most.
You default to them.
Yeah, might have nothing to do with the problem, might not help. So my work is to know that about myself, is to know that's the hammer in the toolbox and everything looks like a nail. And so for me to say, maybe not this time, or to have that response and then give yourself, as Covey would talk about, be responsible. Can I separate my...
Do you find that uncomfortable when you make that little move where you say, my go-to default is these, but I know I need to do something? Is there an uncomfortableness in that? You're kind of entering?
Certainly at first. So for example, I'm also an N, so intuition, the gut. And so when I put that hat on that runs an ambulance service and I'm presented with an opportunity and my gut tells me whether it's good or not. But I had to teach myself to say, but I have to do the math. I've got to run the numbers. I got to build a performa. I got to engage my team. I have to get other thoughts and ideas. And at first that was tough because, the gut says it's good. But then it became second nature. So becoming responsible, as Covey would talk about, becomes easier. But of course, it's nuanced, each little part. And of course, Covey also talked about seek first to understand, and then to be understood. I've always kind of characterized that as his habit of listening. I know he characterizes a little bit differently, but I think we could also call it his habit of curiosity. Seek first to understand, then to be understood.
Boy, that's so easy to say and so hard to do, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially when we get some psychological benefit from being reactive.
Yeah.
Right? There's something that drew us to this industry, whether we're talking emergency medical services, our clients that are within healthcare, our clients that are within public safety, this whole realm. We came to a leadership position because our job was to identify a problem and to fix it. there's probably some kind of little norepinephrine response or some dopamine dump we get to crossing something off the list. But did we really cross it off? Did we really solve it? Did we really put a Band-Aid on it? Because curiosity takes time, and many people hear me use this term, unproductive time. And I use that word only to stir the pot, because of course, what I'm trying to suggest is the things that we today in emergency medical services value and measure are often not the things that create great cultures with high employee engagement. We want to spend time being curious. It's going to take time. But then our UHU might go down because our soup's not out on the truck filling that shift, and those kinds of things. Curiosity is one of those little investments that's going to grow. It's going to take some time to make them.
So you're running an ambulance service, and you've got 2023 stretching out ahead of you with all of the challenges and all of the budgets and all of the numbers to hit and the performance measures to meet. What are you curious about as a leader in an organization? What's sort of at the top of your curiosity list?
Yeah, probably the top of my list is, how will we continue to reimagine this culture that we're after that results in high employee engagement, and doing it without sign-on bonuses, shift differentials, other kind of monetary compensation that those around us are doing. So I'm curious, is that possible? Is that what workers want? What do the workers really want? What do they value? What is the value proposition for them? Not only what I give them per hour, but what I expect of them. That's what I'm really curious about, is what is the value proposition that results in a great culture with high employee engagement? Because frankly, not only in EMS, but I think in our world, we're headed towards some reckoning. I think you can read any news feed today and see large Fortune 500 companies laying off 10+% of their workforce. And so
I just learned this morning that one of the large ambulance services in our nation is laying off people today.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I being curious about that culture and being curious about the value proposition fosters a curiosity that this industry has long ignored. And that curiosity is, what are the real intrinsic rewards for frontline employees, especially in busy, dynamically deployed systems where I may be doing a 911 call, and then I'm doing an interfacility transfer, and I'm doing what are the intrinsic rewards, and how do we structure and create an environment where people don't burn out, but instead find growing levels of fulfillment and satisfaction?
Yeah, Simon Sinek tells a wonderful story in one of his many different TED Talks about Barry Waymiller, who in the Great Recession, like many manufacturing firms, was forced to lay off employees, and he said he wouldn't do it. But they had to save money, and go find the TED Talk. It's a wonderful TED Talk about culture. And they found a way, through people voluntarily taking deferrals, voluntarily taking time off without pay, that saved them millions upon millions of dollars above and beyond what they expected. And Simon talked about how they created this culture where people felt safe. And when they felt safe, valued, the natural response was to trust and cooperate. I'm curious what happened with Southwest. How an organization that was, without question, known for employees that didn't feel afraid for their jobs, that would come up with the most creative solutions and having fun do it. What changed there? I'm curious about that, because I bet you there's a whole bunch of things for me to learn in my practice of leadership. So I'm curious about influence, because it seems to be a skill that is going away in our world. We're not curious about people anymore. We're just judgmental about them. And let me tell you, as a person who has studied influence and regularly tries to teach it, especially to frontline leaders in our supervisor boot camp and supervisor academies, you can't be influential when you bring judgment. If I judge things about John and then I try to be influential, it won't happen. I have to set those aside and just be curious.
Well, I'm hopeful that people will pick up in this coming year this concept of curiosity and make it a priority in their practice of leadership. And my encouragement is that you simply start with being curious about your experience and begin to start asking yourself, am I curious? Am I a curious leader? And we'll continue to remind in our ongoing webinars how important curiosity is, because I think, Aarron, if I'm not mistaken, this is pervading all of our teaching and education today around, in our work with leaders and teams and cultures, is this whole idea of giving up the idea that we have all the answers, but really being open to the possibility of something new.
And my encouragement for everyone listening is, of all of those great suggestions and bullet points that John shared with us, I would hope that you would focus on all of them, but two in particularly. One would be your own experience. It's going to be very hard to create a great culture and find and keep more of the right people when you're dragging. Imagine again, that person in your organization who you always has a smile. How infectious that is. Are you that infectious person? Yes, we have incredible challenges, and I could spend another hour telling you about all the ones I'm worried about when it comes to EMS and healthcare and public safety. But do you bring sunshine with you every day? That's what Covey talks about. He talks about his 7 habits and leaders. And the other is be curious about today's worker. I'll mention a great leader that we've been privileged to work with over the years is Doug Hooten. Doug, as he had 30 plus years as a senior executive in many of our nation's biggest ambulance services, and then as the executive in MedStar, an ambulance service that I think is well renowned and respected in our nation, Doug said, boy, I feel like I've lost touch with today's worker. And went out and got himself mentors who were 20 years old. And he says, boy, it was tough. Boy, it was tough. But he said, I just learned so much. Can we be that curious about them and not bring the judgment to them? They're lazy, they're entitled, they're this and that. Could we somehow set all of that aside and just say, tell me who you are? What makes you tick? What do I do that you love? What do I do that you hate? Could we be really curious without judgment?
Well, I sure enjoyed this, Aarron. Thanks for bringing this
too.
topic. And we will, I'm looking forward to more of these webinars as the year goes by.
Thanks everyone for joining us, and look for our next month's Leadership Alive.